Okay, welcome to War, Revolutions and Terror. I just want to recap and make some other points about general principles, as this is still part of the introduction. Today, then, I want to do possibly three things. One, I want to talk about the French Indian Wars, or the 7 Years' War, particularly as it was happening in the theatre of North America. Then, I want to talk about a lot of French history that's going to be leading up to the French Revolution. So much of this week and next week will be the lead up, because you simply can't understand what the French Revolution is really about unless you understand the background. One of the reasons I think this is so important, because as you will see, there were peculiar features of France that has to do with its history that make that revolution possible, or make that revolution happen, which is a reason why when other nations try to replicate, or other peoples try to replicate that revolution, it's never going to have the same outcome, because the various things in social memory, the class formation, the different appeals that people have, what matters to them, they're all bound up with historical contingency. And one of the worst things, I suppose, about the abstract mind, which is very much the way the modern, a lot of progress in certain areas, is that it tends to neglect really significant contingencies. And that is why, for example, people have stories which they think will eventuate. For example, the Arab Spring, many people in the West, even those that were critical of the George Bush regime, thought that this was going to lead to this great democratic flourishing in the area. This was extremely naive, and it showed that they weren't really thinking that history mattered. And you will see history matters because it's all the stuff, the woof and warp, that is part of day-to-day living, which is, in a sense, the shell shocks of the past, or the continuity of the past that people don't even recognize as essential. Okay, so having said that, let's talk about some general principles, though, which are nevertheless going to be important. And it's one reason why people become very abstract, or can become very abstract, when they're thinking about revolution and talk in some abstractions, because there are some general features about political behavior. But that doesn't mean it's always going to play out the same way in different locations. So the question of authority and representation, I want you to really focus upon that. Representation, we in a more democratic ethos tend to think of representation as somehow being bound up with the approval of the people through the electoral system. Now, this is not initially what representation means at all, but it does. All political authority rests on the leading figures representing, in a sense, some interest, and being backed up by those interests, and being then able to claim legitimacy essentially because there's support for this. So various groups, and as we see in the evolution of state formation and people formation, various groups of people have authority over other groups, and the primordial aspect of gaining authority, you're talking about all the stuff on war, comes out of war. That's where it begins. So the high authority is meant to emerge from, generally emerge from these other, to put it bluntly, warlords that are seeking some concordance between those groups under them and their interests, and that is devolved to this other authority. But of course, if that is structurally the historical basis of what is going on, it doesn't mean that it's always a happy affair, or there's not continually. And when we start looking at French history, we'll see a great example of this in the War of the Fronde, where we'll see, I'll use the term warlords, but important sources of warrior authority become very dissatisfied with the overarching authority, and that it creates a kind of civil war. Okay, and this is you'll find the same thing that happened in Russia in different times. It's a very common phenomenon, and one of the reasons it's so common is because what is happening with any warrior group is they need a food supply. I can't emphasize enough, and this will keep coming back into the picture, the importance of a food supply. Now, the food supply is the condition of the army, and the army is the condition of the state. And having an army and then paying for an army is a recurrent issue. And you might remember when we talked about the English Revolution, I mentioned just briefly in passing, that is a really important constitutive moment of the English Revolution. And it will be really important in what we're going through as well. So when I say about extraction of resources, so for an army to exist, it has to have a food supply. And feudalism is basically exactly that system. Some group of people are getting protection, and they're getting protection to be able to survive for themselves and also supply their protectorate. We're really talking about a protection racket, you could say. They're getting protection by giving supply. That is the basis of taxation. That's really what taxation is providing supply.
Sorry, you say food, is that like actual food, or then include things like coin and...
Oh no, in the first instance just food, but of course because then other goods, because they need weapons to pay for, you can see that, but there's the first basis of it, you know. And in Europe, again, I'll come back to this, but when we talk about the emergence of the feudal system as a result of a real breakdown of urban life in the Western Empire, that's where we see this very, you know, at its rawest. You don't have many big cities at all. So it's just the essentials, and then people providing their weapons, and then they need access to people that can provide, you know, the horses' hooves or whatever, you know, the materials that are essential to day life. But I'll just come back to the formulation that taxation is extraction of a surplus. You have to have the surplus. And it's right, you know, it might begin in food, but then it starts to take off in all sorts of ways and shapes and forms. But you have to have that surplus, and there has to be some means of accessing and protecting that surplus. And in a sense, that's what legitimacy is. That's what representation is. And you'll only really get the surplus unless you've got a complete slave economy, as opposed to the slave sector, as in Rome, say, being an important part of the economy, or in Greece, ancient Greece, and indeed many, many places in the ancient world. Nevertheless, that as long as you've got any degree of freedom that people can make their choice and aren't slavery, then in some way, shape or form, you have to be offering something to maintain that support. And if you don't offer something to maintain that support, then you're in trouble. And in a very simplistic sense, you could say this is really one of the reasons why the French Revolution took place. You had a class system, an authority system, a representative system that wasn't really representative anymore. So the status and the function were out of sync. Status and function emerge together. When they become out of sync, you get discontent. And that discontent can be simply people wanting to burn down the barn of the noble that's overlooking the estate, or an outright revolution. That's when lots of people are burning down the barns, and other things are happening. So once, though, simply, if you like, the movement from warlords to king, then also the king needs to reproduce themselves through the warlord. So there is a symbiotic relationship that's going on. And this idea of symbiosis is, again, it's very important, and I will come back to that. So it needs a revenue, it needs extraction, but there's function. There's a purpose behind function. It's not simply that it just was always this way because, you know, some bozo thought they could do it and other people just accepted it. It's trial and error, but one of the things that we notice is that almost everywhere we can find a certain scale of human organization, it's the same trials and the same outcome emerging. Now, I did just want to go through terror. I think I did mention it last week, but that, and that is simply that magisterial might, the might of any ruler, ultimately depends upon force, and terror is usually a component. The spectacle of terror is often a component in that retention of majestic might, and so it's displayed. The majesty has to be displayed, and terror is a moment of that. So terror is not something, in a sense, in terms of political development, that's ever completely absent from the political stage. Again, more recently, in more modern times, where we've abolished the death penalty, that has tended to be really diminished to being negligible. But this, again, this is a very recent phenomenon. And that use of the violent spectacle, in a way, there's a line of continuity between those that want to usurp power, deploying that as a means of gaining power, to frighten, to terrify others into not opposing their intention, and to make a spectacle of what can become of you if you do get in the way. In the case of the French Revolution, you can see in the case of the French and the Russian Revolution, there's two phases of terror. In the case of the Russian Revolution, it's a much more prolonged and protracted affair. In the case of, but that's because the regime was able to continue. Whereas the French Revolution, the terror phase of the revolution of the Jacobins ultimately led swiftly to their demise. So it was a moment of the revolution. When that moment was abandoned through just too much panic, too much fear, an unwillingness to keep going down that route, the revolution was really, you could say, its end was already sealed at that moment. And that has to do, and it's very similar with the Russian Revolution in this respect. There's only so much genuine support for the radical changes that the new elites are trying to introduce. There's only so much support for it. So in the case of the Russian Revolution, they never relinquished the reign of terror, at least not for, and when they finally did, when it completely, though it was dwindling for a couple of decades before it was finally abolished, but ultimately the desire to have more openness in the Soviet Union led to the whole demise of the system. It couldn't be sustained. Why couldn't it be sustained? I'll go back to that previous term about the representatives. The representatives, the elite, didn't really have enough ingrained sense of common bonding with the interests that they were supposed to represent. It just wasn't there. So again, function and status, they had outlived each other. Well, they were no longer in sync. Okay. I don't know how that happened, but we're going to talk now about there should have been French-Indian Wars written above this, or the 7 Years' War. It's different names for essentially the same thing. If you're French or if you're European, your primary focus will be that it is a part of a larger geopolitical confrontation. The North Americans tend to see it not as the 7 Years' War as such, because what's happening, say, in India between the French and the British is of no concern to them, not immediately. So it took place on 4 continents. Churchill called it the First World War, even though we can find a few other things that you might say even antecede that, because there's other widespread theatres of war happening in some earlier wars of that century, and usually involving the French and the British. Why am I going to talk about this? And that's because we don't really understand why the American War of Independence, which then becomes a revolutionary war, so they're bound up together, why that takes place unless we go at least back into this moment. And there's a long fuse that leads to this, but we'll just start with this French-Indian War. And the different belligerents, I've put them over here, but one of the things that you can see from that is basically you've got German principalities or imperial powers. because Germany at this stage was not an empire. The strongest power in Germany at this stage was, and Germany wasn't a nation, it was a people but not a nation, was Prussia. And Prussia figures very strongly in the history of the 18th century and even in the early part of the 19th century till ultimately Germany gets unified. Prussia has been called, it was an army with a state rather than a state with an army. Yes?
Just because dates are hard sometimes. How does this, when does this happen in relation to a Bismarck?
Oh, this is preceding Bismarck. Bismarck is unifying Germany roughly from the middle of the 19th century onwards, up until about 1890, something like that. But prior to this, you've got all these principalities in Germany. When we come to talk about Napoleon, we'll see one of the things that Napoleon does is, as a reaction, by way of a reaction, he really contributes hugely to the German-speaking people demanding its own form of state and then turning into an empire. Unintended consequence. Remember me saying that last week. And this is something we're going to see all the way through. One lot of people are acting in a way that they think will have a certain outcome. It never has that outcome. The events swallow people up. Again, this is why when we talk about politics, especially when we're talking about really divisive issues and relatively extreme things to the culture and the environment, the economy, etc., introducing big differences, the reactions to that are going to dictate what comes out of it, not just the implementation of it, as if it's like a shopping list. You go to the shop and you pick it up and you get what you want. It just isn't like that. So, just briefly with this war, and broadly about the 7 Years' War, is you've got all these different belligerents pursuing their own interests. From the British point of view, they wanted to prevent French expansion in North America. That's how they got that's why it's such an important theatre of war. They were committed to supporting the House of Hanover, protecting commercial interests in India against French commercial interests, and that was the big fight between the French East India Company and the British East India Company. But Britain also declared war on Spain in 1762 after Spain had formed an alliance with France. And one of the things you will also notice, and this is typical of geopolitics, yesterday's friend can be today's enemy, and vice versa, So, and Portugal and Spain, neighbours, often conflicting, often in contestation. So very often you'd want to ally with one. If you're allied with one of them, that means you're allied against the other one. And you can see there's this global spread here because you've got South America involved in this, in the contestations going on between the Portuguese and Spanish. There was also Austria. Again, we don't think of Austria as a major player, but right up until the First World War, until the demise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria had been a major imperial power. And one of its biggest sources of aggrievement was with the Prussians. And they had wanted to, and the Prussia had conquered territories from the Austrians, and they wanted to get it back, and each one makes a different claim to it, and so on. And this would also bring Austria and Russia into an alliance. But again, if you think about the First World War, they'd be pitted against each other. It depends upon the circumstances. It depends upon the geopolitical drives. And look, bear this in mind too. We are talking about pre-commercial society or pre-industrial revolutions. So the Industrial Revolution taking place in the 19th century. So what commerce is able to achieve once there is an Industrial Revolution, and what is able to be achieved in terms of commercial growth or even economic growth, is often what's most important. This phase of historical development is simply resource extraction, manpower and resource extraction. And again, that's essentially why they're fighting over territories. Russia would switch sides. So these shifting alliances. Sweden wants to regain Pomerania that had been taken by Prussia. Sweden then was still a major power. Again, we think of Sweden now as as the peace-loving guys. You know, well, that wasn't always the case. You remember me saying, I think I said it last week, all peoples, as peoples, have survived through blood on their hands. And generally, you could say the bigger the scale of the unit, the more blood there's going to be there. You know, that's just this is just the historical condition or the human condition. So now moving to the French Indian Wars, remember that prior to the independence, or prior to these victories of the British, and then eventually the victory of the United States over the British, or what would become the United States over the British, that there were a few competitors in what we now call the United States and Canada. And the big ones were the British and the French. And French will keep some territory even into the period of Napoleon, but they would ultimately be the losers in this war. Now, the French had populated parts of North America, but what their population was doing and the scale of the population was quite distinct to what was happening in what we now call the United States. And basically, it was trapping, fishing, trapping for fur trading. There was some farming, but it was basically a much smaller scale, spread out, going into, you know, from their point of view, this was a kind of wilderness. And the Indians, they would often do cooperation, or they'd be stealing stuff, or there'd be attacks, raids on each other. But this was from the north, from the position of what would become the United States. The French were simply getting in their way of land. So it had a lot to do with land. Okay. Typically, also, this was another difference. Typically, settlers from France didn't stay there. They'd go there, make their money, and return. This was very different to what the let's call them North Americans. Okay, the British North Americans were doing. They would stay there. They would build towns. They'd build more towns. They'd build more larger units. There'd be more farming, less of the trapping. There'd still be trade going on between them, but ultimately much more populous. And in the larger cities there, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, each had 16,000 plus population. And overall, there was about 1 million of them, whereas in 1755, the entire Canadian population was 63,000. As I said, there'd been a long history of skirmishes between the French and British over the colonies, and that goes back at least into the 16th century, in the Battle of Bay-de-Bic. And there were 3 other French-British wars in the colonies prior to the 7 Years' War. So ongoing tussles, all part of a bigger picture of France and Britain collision of geopolitical interests. 3 that are just worth mentioning, that are, again, are precursors to this being a major theatre of war, was the King William War, the Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. And you notice that they're often bound up with succession. And again, you have to bear in mind, why is that? Well, basically, we're talking dynastic politics here, familial politics. Up until liberal democracy is firmly established, and you know exactly when does it become established, but even when in the earlier part of the 20th century, when it looks like it's got the running, then you start to see communism and fascism contest for it. So for a very long time, the family, and that also means is the basis, the royal family is the basis of political power, but who is heir to the lineage? And as they start marrying and intermarrying, this leads to all sorts of territorial contestations. I can't remember if I said last week, but in England, for example, when William the Conqueror goes and defeats Harold and sets himself up, you've still got this feudal system. So you've got all these fiefdoms beholden to him in France. So this will lead to these constant warfare between the English and the French, because they're not thinking in terms of this is my territory solely. They're thinking of who owes me what, because I have this royal power and these people are mine, even though I'm not living there anymore. So we need to go back and conquer it. And those on the ground are thinking, well, why would I let them, they're not here anymore. We give the power to someone who can protect us here and now. So you see, this is this tapestry of alliances and oath, and the oath is the basis of the feudal system. This tapestry of interests is one in which there's going to be invariable conflicts over dynastic succession, of which there is. Now, what we notice here, though, is the so-called New World, as it would be called, is very much bound up with the Old World. And we will see shortly that there's some things about the New World which are different. They're really different. So they are quite different conditions. But in this instance, we see it hasn't been able to escape it, the Old World. Now, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, there were many wars with the colonialists, between the colonialists and the Indians. But there were also wars between Indian tribes. So it wasn't just that the Native Americans were all unified in their interests. And this happened in South America too. When Cortez and Pizarro and that go and conquer the Aztecs and the Incas and destroy them, one of the reasons they're able to do it is those groups have made many enemies. And so they're able to piggyback, in a sense, off the cycle of violence that's going on, and then ultimately bring all into its interests, and that can be disastrous. But again, short-term interests, long-term interests, people don't understand what their long-term interests are because they cannot see the future. So various treaties have been entered into, various treaties have been broken, and land is at the basis. Land is the basis of resource. Even well into the late 18th century, economists are still thinking that the source of wealth is land. Still thinking that. Now, we, again, in the post-industrial revolution society, don't think of land as that important at all. We can pay for that. What is much more important is the robustness of your economy and how that is being organized. So basically, manufacturing, trading, financial shifts. You think of a place like Hong Kong or Singapore. Hong Kong's in trouble at the moment, but they've made a fortune out of basically focusing on finance capital. Anyway, so their land is the issue. Now, this French-Indian War, what's one of the interesting things about it is the person that would be ultimately the first president and the leader of the American War of Independence against the British, and hence the American Revolution, was none other than George Washington, who was a very young man who was involved in a scouting party, and again it was to do with land off the Ohio River, and there were French Canadians in there, trappers, etc., also wishing to mark off land. And Washington and a small group with him came across this group. A skirmish broke out, and after the French had surrendered, this character often called the Half King, Tanacharison, pulled out his tomahawk and scalped the leader of his French group. He told others that that Washington's men had done this execution, but it came out later that he had lost the plot. Whether there was he hated the French, by the way, this leader, so he had various other grievances against them. But the consequence of this was the French then retaliated. Washington had to admit the blame, and he couldn't even read the accusation against him because it was in French, but he signed it and accepted the blame, and this triggered off. It's really triggered off this war. This was in a sense, just like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. You've got all these things in place, and then one act is the spark, and this was really the spark. So they kept, the skirmishes kept going on, and he was captured but eventually released. Now, the Indians fought on both sides. Many stayed neutral, but in these kind of wars, in any war, neutrality is a very difficult thing. So generally, there were more Indians with the French, and I've given you a list here of the different allies on either side. You can look at it at your own time. But after some initial losses, the British were victorious, and in part, that's because the French were so stretched in Europe. Now, when we get to the American, so this is going to be an important thing, is in any imperial power, the question is, something happened over there, and you need to pay for it and provide the resources to defend it. At which point does it become a sump hole? When is it just not worth it? And ultimately, when we get to why the Americans defeated the British, the biggest reason is it just wasn't worth the economic candle for the British to keep fighting. And in this instance, it wasn't worth the French candle. Now, various other things happened to the Indians afterwards. There was Pontiac's rebellion, and very often, and some of the treatment by the Indians is, remember, the biggest horror that the North American or Native American Indians faced, or Native American people, if we don't want to use that term, but faced, was in the 19th century. That was really the genocide. That was really the mass transference in which many died, treaties just ripped up. It was a horror. And it was bound up with the expansion of the railway, and the expansion of the farmers. In some ways, apart from the railway, which opened up the land, the idea for land, again, that's the oldest source of usurpation that there is. We find it's exactly that brings, or is one of the major factors, there's many factors, but one major factor in bringing about the end of the Roman Empire. It was the same thing. A group of people coming in and taking over territory. In this case, the group of people have, come from Britain or from Europe. There's lots of German stuff coming in, etc. But the treatment, one of the most notorious was General Amherst, who basically infected blankets with smallpox and handed this out. So you can see why by the time of the 19th century, Native Americans are not going to think very well, even though many had been siding with the British, drawing up treaties, getting protection. Again, this protection racket is working at all levels, and then finding that the protector is cheating on them, is reneging on them, is ultimately abandoning them. Now, this is a very good example of another thematic. Now, I did say to you last week, I'm a political scientist, though I don't think there's really much science in politics, but as a political scientist, we do tend to try and discover some kind of patterns. But as I've also pointed out, this stuff is so historical, we have to be very wary. So the patterns I want to draw out, I think they're pretty threadbare, but they're important enough for you to know that they're not insignificant. But the flesh of the story is always in the details. But one threadbare principle we can draw out is today's victory can sow the seeds of tomorrow's defeat. And this was exactly the case in this instance. So the British had won. They had gained most of New France in North America, Spanish Florida. They had gained more control in India, some islands in the West Indies, some parts of Senegal and Manila. In 1763, now they knew, the Crown knew that the settlers or the colonialists were a problem because they were land hungry. And as I said, this would be a huge problem. It would create horrific conditions, this hunger for land. But the hunger was there. Not only was the hunger there, the British were a long way away. What have they got to do with me? Yes, there's some troops there and everything, and they fought here, but at the end of the day, we won, and ultimately they're protecting our interests. And now they're trying to tell us that we can't expand our land. No way. We want to be farmers. We want to be wealthy. This is the whole reason we're living in this godforsaken place. We're in a new world, not the old world. We've got opportunities they don't have. Don't hamper us with rules and regulations that may make sense in your world, but in our world, they don't make any sense. Now, this has been a very costly affair, like wars are. And this huge debt also meant they needed to get their money back. So now you also must remember too that one of the big formulations that comes out of the American War of Independence is the formulation which you may have heard: no taxation without representation. And how that then becomes in the American mindset is, well, we don't have any members of parliament, so we're not being represented. But you've got to remember, 90% of British people didn't have any representation in that sense. The representative, so to speak, of a borough through largesse was speaking on behalf of, but there was only about, as I said, only about 10% of the people or property holders could vote, and not women. So they needed money. So this would be another trigger. And the French, they got a big debt as well. So they left with a big debt. But instead of getting out while the going was good, as we will see, they decided to throw more money into this sump hole. And this would have a huge negative effect. So I said New World, Old World. Let's just talk about that for a moment. It was just location. British law, that's where the laws are being made, even though there's certain regulations and rules and laws happening amongst, the different colonial communities, but that community, they're not unified. But anything that comes from the Crown applies to them all, but it's a long way away. The other thing, too, is the religious. Now, this is one of the reasons I'm going to be speaking so long in this week and next week about the religious wars, and to understand the fabric of that and the importance of it is because, now from where we sit, this seems to be something, people often use the formulation medieval. Well, this is not the medieval time at all. It's up until very recently. Religion has really mattered. And the religious fabric of a social formation really mattered. And you might remember me saying that from last week, that the Calvinists, when I was talking about the Reformation, and we'll come back to the Calvinists because they're going to be an important contributor to the French Revolution, that the Calvinist idea of a republic started to spread into Holland and then in Scotland, and then that would also play a part in the English Civil War. And many of the colonialists from Britain had initially been, in a sense, religious refugees, you could say, moving into America. But then the more and more people were coming over, and it was just a different world. That whole world of religious conflict, still part of the old world. The old world. The old world being, Europe. New world, they're basically figuring it out for themselves. They've got their little communities. They can be quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Regimented or quite strict in what's expected, but then you could go and leave a community. If you could get out, you could go somewhere else. Also, in the main, the Protestants were anti-monarchical. Again, remember Calvinism, Republic. That goes right back to Calvin, John Calvin, very anti-monarchical. So there was this freedom from old world conflicts, but also a different perception about where the locus of political authority really resided. Which is also why they were quite receptive to more modern political ideas about political life. And after the Reformation, more and more, not completely divorced from religion, but I'll just say not dominational, non-dominational ideas about politics were being developed by these early philosophers of what we call the Enlightenment. They include figures like Thomas Hobbes, very important as a character called John Locke, who argued for the primacy of property rights. And what you're seeing in this is there's really that whole way of speaking about politics from the religious perspective, which is central, say, to Martin Luther, central, say, to John Calvin, that's just gone. It's just gone. So in a sense, it piggybacks on the Reformation, but it's now something new. So bluntly, there's a new set of narratives about representation and legitimacy that come out of what later will be called the liberal tradition, in which the basis of representation is in the people, and the monarchy at best is a constitutional power. On paper, that was certainly the way it was in England, because the Parliament had all sorts of rights. In practice, the king still had a lot of power under the English crown, so it's not exactly what we mean by a constitutional monarchy. But liberty and property are the centerpiece of these new discussions coming out of Western Europe about the nature of political obligation. Liberty and property. As we said, people in the New World, they want property and they want liberty. And liberty means not just doing what you want, it means, though, having a say in what you can do and what you can do with your property. Okay. Now, another thing to remember is this. So this is certainly a set of ideas that are in the air which suggest independence. Now, there were, though, a number of people that still felt loyal to the British Crown in the North American colonies. So the War of Independence, this is often not mentioned or it's ridden over, but it's also a civil war, which is invariably the revolutionaries are civil wars, but it is a civil war. But it's also a war of independence. So it's a war of independence, it's a civil war, and it becomes, in the doing, a revolution. Now, no one, when they initially thought they're doing something that's going to have all these great implications for the rest of the world. But as the momentum gains, this is precisely what happens in the American Revolution. It starts to see itself as a kind of model and becomes something for export. Now, it's never quite at the same caliber of let's export this in the same way that the French did. In France, for example, Danton in one of the assemblies says, yes, even the Chinese should have their own nation and should be a nation just like us. So, you know, he's saying the whole globe should follow our model. But nevertheless, and this Civil War thing, it's interesting that Benjamin Franklin is an important contributor to the politics of the period. His illegitimate son was a loyalist. Now, it tended to be geographically located where the loyalists were and where the patriots, as they were called, were. But ultimately, you could see even families getting caught up in this conflict. So I said prior to the war, the colonies were not united, no common authority. So but you basically had kind of town hall meetings. So it was very localized, and then there's a recognition of mutuality of interest. So let's throw in our lot with each other. In this way, it's not that different from the way monarchies arise. Monarchies arise out of assemblies. You know what I said, the warlords, but the warlords also in assembly with those people are going to, this kind of symbiotic trade-off. The colonies were wealthy, and there were traders, there were merchants, there were bankers, there were lawyers, but it was still a predominantly agricultural society. And this is, although France was predominantly agricultural, the scale of urbanization in France will be much bigger, so the numbers of the professional classes will be much bigger, and so we start to see ways in which the French Revolution I would just put it bluntly. The French Revolution is the first revolution of the professional classes as professional classes. And the professional classes, the Marxist term is bourgeois, but Marx then, we'll talk about this later, but Marx uses the term bourgeoisie in a rather distinctive sense that had become relatively commonplace in the 1840s at the time he's using it. But at the time of the French Revolution, the word had quite a different meaning. Anyway, this will appear again. So it was fueled by a demand for representation, the British trying to extract resources, introducing taxes, particularly a tax on stamped paper. That is, anything that had any official nature was eventually rescinded because it was so unpopular. But whether you got a degree or whether you could set up a practice or something, you wanted to have a will, any legal document, all of this stuff you had to pay taxes on. It does not seem that the taxes were that onerous, but that's not really the point. The point was that you had these taxes upon a people that really thought, what are they doing here? Just leave us alone. Go away. We don't need you. And then tea was taxed, and of course the Boston Tea Party, as it was called. There's a great song by the sensational Alex Harvey band called the Boston Tea Party, an old band from the 70s I really like. Here on the other side, you can see the different flags. So there's a movement towards having a national set of symbols, which of course will eventually become the Stars and Stripes. But already you see that transition taking place. As I said, it was a new world, but it existed in the context of a much older world. And the two oldest things about that world, which were pre-modern European or pre-contemporary European, were one, the tribal peoples, and as we said, they had been split, and the other was one of the most ancient of economic social practices, slavery. So these things, from the European point of view, and this, of course, slavery would, of course, be something that would be a tremendous burden in the development of the United States, and of course lead to a civil war. A tremendous burden, but also it was a burden because people didn't want to let it go, particularly in the South. They wanted to hang on to a property, and a slave was just a property. And of course, the ancient justification for slavery was, you are my slave because I have spared your life in war. But of course, North American slavery is just straight out plunder and pillaging. It's really got nothing to do with that. It's simply a commercial practice. In the North and in the South, one of the things that's happened is much earlier the North had prohibited it, but also because the different kind of commercial makeups of the North and South. And to put it bluntly, slavery is a very inefficient form of commercial activity unless it's something like plantation work. That's okay. Plantation work, you just need lots of manpower. You've got a crop, you do it. Someone oversees it. It's not that expensive to oversee it. You're just brutal and you're cruel and you extract the resource. But the resource you're extracting is, you don't need to turn it into something from a factory yet. Or you don't need to do that. You sell it to someone else that will. So you do the cotton, and up north they can do making the jumpers or whatever, the suits or whatever, clothes. But what you've got then is different economic bases. Now, the economic base of a society is always important. It's not exclusively important. And in fact, completely understanding the economic basis of any society becomes very difficult because there's many aspects to it. But it is not negligible. It's very important. Okay. So with this victory of, and I'm not going into the military side of the war, that doesn't concern us here at all, but with the victory, a new kind of government had been formed. In many ways, it could see itself as simply a continuation of what the English Revolution was doing, but of course there's no crown left. Presidential powers in many ways are quite monarchical in some ways, especially, say, emergency powers around war, etc. But, as I said, all these enlightened ideas, and even religious ideas, now this is going to create something of a split to this day, which we can still see in North America. And that is the philosophical ideas about the ultimate source of authority, that is God, to which one gives some sort of loyalty or acknowledgement, who provides order in the cosmos. This is a philosophical idea. Of course, once atheism kicks in, this position called deism is no longer necessary, and that's, you know, one of the things that we see in the shifting of a of a secular society. But for people on the ground, and even during the American War of Independence, there was all sorts of very committed Protestants, biblical Christians, arguing their case in very biblical terms. So you've got, on the one hand, a biblical Christendom very much at the grassroots, but increasingly so. And there's a considerable number, by the way, not quite half, but it's not, you know, it might be a third of early representatives involved in drawing up the new state have a background in Freemasonry. And the Freemasons, of which, well, members of the Freemasons have kind of histories, and you can read books on this that are, you know, fantastical, to put it bluntly. But the core idea, or a number of core ideas of it, is this idea of a deity which is identical to what the philosophers had been teaching. So, you know, one of the things I've wondered for a long time is, how do these philosophical ideas, apart from people reading them, but not everyone is reading these philosophers, how do they spread so quickly? And I think the Masonic lodges are an important part of the dispersion of what is essentially a philosophical idea, though with the Masons there's still rituals done to, you know, for members within the lodge, but ultimately that idea is it's the same as the philosophers. So a number of professionals are joining these lodges. It helps them with their work, helps them get ahead. There's a connectedness, a social connectedness that becomes part and parcel of the social fabric. Of course, there's all sorts of, you know, crazy stuff written about the Freemasons. You know, the Nazis basically saw the Freemasons as like the communists and all of this. Well, that's pretty nuts. But it is an aspect of the historical conditions and circumstances that's playing a part in the spread of these kind of ideas. When the Declaration of Independence was drafted, it was drafted by a committee that included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Jefferson. Jefferson was a slave owner. That's important. He even had a slave child. But initially, now the reason I draw this out is Jefferson, of all those characters, is by far the most manifestly pro-enlightenment kind of thinker. The one who speaks in terms of universal rights and you know, let's spread this out to the whole world, and everybody should have these rights, yet he himself was a slaveholder. And these kind of contradictions are palpable from the American experience, specifically from those coming from the South, as I said. He had wanted a section denouncing slave trades, but when push come to shove, he didn't give away his slaves. Neither did Washington, neither did many others that had slaves. And he also wanted to denounce the British people as a whole, which, again, that wasn't included. But what was included was, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's this idea that there's a natural light of reason that can understand truth as truth. This is a very enlightened idea that comes back from people like Rene Descartes and other philosophers that are pioneers of the Enlightenment. All men are created equal. Again, if you think about that for about 5 seconds, in what way? In capacity, okay. In capacity. Opportunity, no. In resources, you know, you start to see these are very abstract. And over time, they certainly have a narrative efficacy. So when we look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we can see there's a line now between this way of seeing rights coming out of the Enlightenment and what the UN is doing. But if we go back further historically, and we go back to certain documents in which rights have been purported and claimed, we see they're actually of a very different character. In the past, they're referring to, as in, say, the Magna Carta, they're referring to gains that have been won and established legally. Now, as a constitutional principle, this is meant to oversee the law. So the law then will piggyback upon this claim. But the claim itself is purely philosophical. And when I say it's purely philosophical, it's not an easy argument. I don't think, for example, that there is a successful argument that really can justify this. But that's a whole other point. Other philosophers will disagree. You get 20 philosophers in the room, they can have a bun fight about it. And they are endowed by their creator. This is the deist God. Notice this, the creator. It's not the Christian God anymore. And so this what's happening is a drift at this level of public narrative, public commitment, which is not specifically Christian, which can overlap with the Freemasons and with the philosophers of the Enlightenment, with other set of much more Calvinist or Anglican and Episcopalians and other religious groups that are in the United States. And there's a kind of jostling and tension that's going on in the United States. And in fact, I would say overall, at least up until Donald Trump, I don't want to get into this too much, I'll just say, but I would say up until his presidency, and in fact I wrote a piece just before he got to power in which I made this claim, and then I realized I had qualified it immediately once he had won the election before it got published, that public narrative in the US is very Calvinist, but it's secular Calvinist. I won't go too far into that, but it's the secular bit that's this deist bit. Okay. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, see where the locus of authority is, deriving the just powers from the consent of the governed. This is all from John Locke, really. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of this end, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it, the right of rebellion, and to institute new government, etc., etc. Okay, for safety and happiness. Now, let's move from the American Revolution to France. I finally got there. The French had supplied soldiers, supplied a navy, fleets, and given money for arms, and entered in the war in 1778 of the American Revolution, the War of Independence. Though French and American armies only acted together from 1781, which hastened the victory of the colonialists, the Spanish and the Dutch. So here you've got this thing happening, you've got these other imperial powers all trying to take an interest. The obvious irony is you've got an absolutist monarchy supporting a group that is fighting against absolutist monarchy. One of the, and I'm just, this story I think is symptomatic of the kind of failure of the crown in France to really understand the world in which it was participating. Now, when we get to speak a bit more detail about the French Revolution and Louis XVI, I'd have to say that, you know, as far as monarchs go, Louis was a pretty decent kind of guy. You know, he wasn't overly cruel, he wasn't overly brutal, but he was the wrong guy at the wrong place. And the only way that the crown could have been saved was through severe measures of terror, which certainly he wasn't prepared to implement. And in the long run, you might have only won a generation or so. So, you know, at which point do you give up? Because you can't, there's no point. But this story I'm going to tell now about Beaumarchais, I think is indicative of the kind of inability of the French crown to really gauge what's going on. So this character Beaumarchais was a playwright, an inventor, watchmaker, and an arms dealer. And he became an intermediary between the French government and the British. So now the thing about Beaumarchais was his play, The Marriage of Figaro, is one of the earliest theatrical attacks upon the French crown. And what it was mocking was the way in which aristocratic society was functioning in France, and it was mocking basically undue privilege. It was really a theatrical claim about the importance of genius, talent. That's the only thing that should matter. But you aristocrats, now there were all sorts of new aristocrats that were, because the nobility was an office in which it was a fundraising office. I'll talk about this a bit later again, but it was basically a fundraising office, a way of getting resources from another group. And you could buy that office. So there were all these newcomers into the aristocracy that were bourgeois, that basically people had made their money in the cities, made it from other sources, and now were part of a new nobility. So the nobility was starting, again, different function. Now the function just seems to be a way of extracting resources, but what are you actually doing to protect that status that you've attained, especially if it can be bought? So this is the kind of thing that Beaumarchais is holding up to ridicule. And it was performed, and the king, and not only was it performed by the king, the Barber of Seville, a similar play by him, similar to thematics in it. Mary Antoinette, who used to like, and if you go to Versailles, have you been to Versailles? If you go there, you can see the little area, a little part of this huge palace with these massive grounds, and there's one bit where you can see it's a kind of rustic area. It's meant to be a kind of peasant-like retreat where Mary Antoinette and her friends used to dress up and, play at having sheep and whatever, being rustic people. And she performed in the play. So there was all sorts of disputes about the play and fines, but ultimately a prison sentence, but then he gets up with a state pension. So this is a guy that really goes from being an outsider, potential criminal, to being a go-between for the French crown. And you can think, wow, this is kind of deranged. What is happening here? By the way, one of the things about the Americans, they needed money. They needed money to fight the British. But once they got the money, they often said, well, this is a gift. And the others, no, it wasn't a gift, just a loan. When are you going to pay us back? Don't worry. Who's going to pay it back? Who's responsible for this now? That was then. We didn't even have a government as such then. And the family of Beaumarchais would eventually get a small bit back, but it went on for 50 years. Now, the finance minister at the time, Turgot, who's also an important economist, and man of letters, a man of the Enlightenment, had tried to dissuade the crown, Louis, from this course of action, but to no avail. Ultimately, what did they get out of it? And the answer is, well, they really got nothing out of it except more debt. It hoped to weaken Britain's geopolitical situation, but Britain carried on trading with the US, and it turned out to be much cheaper just to be trading partners than to be a colony, which you've already, you've protected in one war, and now they're on their own. Good, off you go, you do it. But leave us alone, basically. And Britain had never overly committed their resources to this war because they had learnt their lesson from the 7 Years' War as well, or from the French Indian Wars. And this is interesting too. There was a lot of sympathy in the Parliament including this character Edmund Burke, who I mentioned, because Edmund Burke, once the French Revolution was happening, Edmund Burke, so this was in the early phase, what we call the constitutional phase of the French Revolution, the constitutional monarchy phase of the French Revolution. Edmund Burke was a real critic of the French Revolution, but he had supported the colonists in the War of Independence. He had supported it. And in this respect, he was not unlike a number of members of Parliament. So there was widespread sympathy in the United Kingdom to what the Americans were doing. The biggest losers in the aftermath of the war were Native Americans. As I mentioned that what would happen in the 19th century, the land grab, the moving to California and going further into Texas, and annexation from seizure of territory from the Mexicans and so on. But also the African Americans who had fought on both sides in a hope to win favor. At different times, both sides said that we will help you, we'll release you from slavery, but it never happened. Early on, Washington had perceived this could be a problem and actually prohibited slaves from joining the cause, only he would rescind that a couple of years later. It would be 2 decades later, the North would ban it, but the slave would hang on grimly till there was a civil war. The British did repatriate many slaves who had fought with them as free men to Canada, West Indies and Africa, but thousands of slaves remained slaves as they were shipped to the West Indies and their masters. Britain abolished slave trade in 1807. So there is an argument, even though it was still extracting resources from the West Indies. So it was a, it was a grey area, to put it mildly. But there is an argument that had the North Americans stayed British, that slavery would have been abolished much quicker. Whether or not that's true, who knows? But I will say it was in no one's real interest to keep the practice of slavery going, except the immediate beneficiaries of it, the immediate slaveholders. But in terms of larger territorial units moving to more commercial, this is nascent industrialization, forms of industrialization. This is not a good way to go. Spain would secede Florida in 1819, and Mexico would win independence against Spain in 1821, but lose territories, as I said, the example of Mexico, Texas, not New Mexico, Texas, California, lose territories to the US. So France had paid for a war of independence. It created a political order that was the exact antithesis to the ancient regime. Now, this is a big deal, what the Americans have got. It's not like anywhere else on earth. So when France is inspired, or when some of the French are inspired by this, and there's various Americans wandering around, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, their ambassadors or some functionary, Jefferson, Thomas Paine, although British born, had written a book called Common Sense. He was seen as a champion of the American Revolution. He would end up being put in prison by the Jacobins for having supported the Gironde. I'll talk about those groups later. And he was lucky not to be executed, but he was in favour of the revolution in a big way. But this certainly fueled the aspirations. Of course, one of the great generals in the war was General Lafayette, who would also be an important player, especially in the earlier phase of the French Revolution. So what had happened in America was old world goes to new world now coming back to old world. We're seeing this circulatory spirit and development. Now, we're going to have to go back further in time. So we're moving from that, so hold that in your head. But now we're going back further in time to think about the long fuse of the French Revolution, because it is a very long fuse. And to repeat myself, the scale of the order of magnitude is massive. Why is it massive? Because this is the first time in the old world, Europe world, that there is an anti-Christian revolution, though we'll see later that the so-called anti-Christian phase of the revolution is put down, but that's something of a misnomer. I'll say it again. It was an anti-Christian revolution. That's no insignificant thing. Why? Because the church has led, and even with the Reformed churches, the narratives around orientation, around what time the future you're going to have, about how society will reproduce, all the various offices that are filled as part of an economic ordering and social ordering, they're all going to be drastically changed. Of course, because the revolution wasn't a success overall, there were gains and setbacks, but over time, the gain would outweigh the setback. Okay, so this change had taken place. Because to put it very bluntly, France was like everywhere else in Europe up until the revolution. The ancient regime was what carried the day, largely. Now, we're going to look at the affinities between the internal social class and religious and political conflict, including internal rebellions, wars, and geopolitical wars, which we've already done, and we'll see that this keeps becoming a theme all the way through. I've mentioned already, it becomes a model, but there are contingencies which don't fit anywhere else, which is why it's going to be hard to transplant. So the conditions. Well, here I've just repeated myself about political units protection, territorial protections. Now, the one thing when I was talking about that earlier, I didn't really say very much about the spiritual glue of communities. And again, in the early, larger scale kinds of social formation, we find that the supplication of the gods or the forces of the world outside your immediate human experience, which you take direction from, that is, the gods provide the protection of the community. And you need an intermediary. The priests are intermediaries. This is of course, with the Protestant faith. That's why the Reformation is a really big deal in the unraveling of Christendom, even though the last thing from the imagination of the Reformers was that they were unraveling Christendom. But the unraveling begins in one primary factor, which is one of the most archaic lines of continuity between Christianity and everything else in the old world, other spiritual practices, and that is this idea of priest as intermediary. With the Reformation, the priest is no longer an intermediary. The priest is just a member of the community. They may lead the prayer service, but that's it, which is very different from what the priest within the Catholic community was, or what the priests are in other pagan societies. Okay, so the earliest, so this is why ritual was traditionally also such an important part of ancient societies. What we've got then is, in France, what's starting to occur is a recognition or a widespread belief that that group of intermediaries is not needed, and in fact they need to be replaced by another group of intermediaries. You still need intermediaries, but no longer with God as such, but with the world as it is. The world as such. That is, you need to understand the nature of what it is to be human, the nature of the world, the nature and purpose of the direction we're going in. This is what the philosophes will ultimately be. This is what they're aspiring to be. In a sense, they are, previously the clergy were the first estate. That now is going to be displaced by the philosophers. And that's what's happening again in the lodges, because it's the same kind of ideas. It will become, to put it bluntly, ideational, rather than figurative and ritualistic. It'll become about ideas, which is why, again, when we get to it, and why in our society, the ideas-broking classes, which includes all sorts of people from academics, teachers, journalists, and then inevitably politicians are drawn into this, lawyers, they all become intrinsic to the new world that we're making now. By the new world now, I mean not just the United States, but the new kind of social formation that appears in the wake of the Russian Revolution. Now, I just mention or reiterate because it's so important, and I do think in the main the stories told by the philosophers, the enlightened philosophers, basically boil down to this. Crown and clergy were two conspiratorial groups that suppressed the people. That's really their story. They suppressed them how? By superstition. They mystified the nature of political and spiritual authority. They mystified the nature of spiritual authority by making up all these bullshit stories about Jesus or Muhammad or whoever. In fact, there was and Moses. There was a very famous Enlightenment pamphlet called the three. What was it? I'm not going to say the three idols. That's not quite right. But the three something or other, the great deluders or something like that. And it was attacking all these leading figures of traditional religious authority. So that's the enlightened story of how political authority arises. It's just not true. Historically, you just see, well, you know, at times, yeah, at times different groups have tried to gain from their circumstance. I don't deny that. But the idea that that is the source of it is just not true. And it's not true, as I said, because basically what you had was a sacrificial order. Each group played its part in holding the show together. That goes back to gender divisions, youth and aged, what marriage was, what the family was, what the relationship between a territorial ruler and to whom he is his bondsman, or to whom he has bonds and obligations. You can see this tapestry of obligations. It's we call a sacrificial order. And because it's a sacrificial order, the sanctification of that sacrificial order meant that the priest class had a very significant role to play. And you can see this even in, if you go back to Greece and Rome, for example, it's very hard to make the case that the Romans and the Greeks were particularly religious in any kind of modern sense. But public sacrifices to the gods was all important. That really did matter. And Socrates would be executed, for example, because it was said he didn't believe in the gods. Various other examples, but okay. So with the fall of the Roman Empire, we've got to bear in mind just how broken Western Europe was in terms of it having had lots of cities, large-scale trading routes, militarily protected, and this all comes asunder. It's being broken in, first of all, by all these other tribes coming into Rome, settling there, attacking it. Then the civil wars that are going on in Rome. There's plagues, there's pestilence. There's a whole lot of things that are leading to this breakdown of that order. And ultimately, the Roman Empire, it moves to Byzantium, which will eventually be conquered by the Muslims. So it moves there. Western Europe now is very vulnerable. It doesn't have a strong military protection unit. It has to be relatively localized. And you've basically got three sources of problems for people in Western Europe. So for a couple of hundred years, I'd have to say life living in Western Europe must have been a horror show. And that is, you had the Vikings coming down from the north, you had the Magyars coming across from the east, and Muslims coming from the south. Ultimately, this is the conditions under which what we call feudal society, this new kind of series of obligations. Because once you've got urban life, you still have obligations and everything, but it's a different scale and there's different ways of doing things. And that's why once you've got re-urbanization and then a larger scale of urbanization that begins in Western Europe in the 10th, 11th century, 11th and 12th centuries, then you start to get new patterns of political obligation emerging. This will be a serious crisis. Here's a kind of my political theory, political science formulation. When you change the nature of how political obligation is being undertaken, you are ripe for serious conflict, because you're going to have hegemonic contenders who are used to, who demand, in fact, loyalties, and they're not going to get it from groups they think they should, that it's owed to them. So at this stage, the Christian religion was really, because oath making was so important, the priest class, which happened now to be Christian, had this great power. They sealed the oath. And so you cannot talk about European history for the first almost up until by modern times, let's say around the 18th century, some aspects of the 7th century, you cannot leave what's happening within Christendom out of the picture, because it's playing a decisive role in defining political obligation and indeed defining the way in which the kinds of stories that people have in order to socially reproduce themselves. Now, at the time of the French Revolution, I just mentioned, there's still many remnants of feudal life. Remnants. It's not like it was still out and out of feudal society. But of course, the transformations that are taking place, with urbanization, for example, they don't all happen in one go, unless there's something like a revolution. And even then, as we said, the revolutionary setbacks meant that it still didn't happen all in one go. Now, urban life is predicated upon getting a sufficient surplus. You get a sufficient surplus that you can go and trade it. So trade is the basis. Trade is the basis of an urban centre, and trade as a basis begins really in a market. Now, what accelerated the process was the role of cathedrals. So it's very interesting, the role of architecture and the history of art plays in the development of a new Europe. That's a whole other story. I'm just drawing it to your attention, though, that this, though, in turn, is solidifying clerical power. It's solidifying clerical power, because all the artisans and craftsmen are now, because with this surplus, you can trade things, and more people go into first the market, then the village, then the town, then the bigger centre, go in to make things that can alleviate the burdens of everyday life and help you do new things. But there's also a spiritual component, a religious component to it, and that's all in the stories. So remember, this is essentially a pre-literate society, and that's why if you travel around Europe and you look at all the old cathedrals, you're seeing the whole story at the time of that building, and those buildings could often take 100 years more to build. In fact, many of them just seem to be ongoing projects. And and then you had stonemasons moving around, and you had clerics moving around. You know, one of the most famous theologians of the 11th century is a guy called Anselm of Canterbury. He came from Italy, spent time in France, ends up in England. So you're starting to have quite a mobile population. When you've got that mobile population, of course, that is creating a bit of a problem for a feudal system, which is a very stable system. You know, you owe me this because you are there doing this. And this creates all sorts of tensions and conflicts, and there's a great civil war that goes on between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, and that really defines so much of the medieval period, the conflict between what's called the Guelphs and Ghibellines. I don't need to go too much into that, but you'll see there's a period of protracted warfare, and as this is happening also, there's some areas becoming more centralized. France is one of them. Britain and France are probably the two most obvious centralizing new kinds of modern states, or quasi-modern, I should say. When also you've got urban interests, rural interests, and the interests of rural producers and urban producers, although you couldn't have urban life without rural life, the interests start to really split. And one of the things that you'll probably note, if you want to know whether someone is a conservative or not, one indication will be, not the only one and not in all cases, but as a generality, there's a truth in this, is regional dwellers will tend to be more conservative than urban dwellers. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, but farmers too, you know, what a farmer has to do, what they're working with, and what someone, again, in urban life with professionals, you're working with ideas all the time. You might work in machinery, but if once you start, you know, being a professional, you're working with documents, you're reading, you're talking, there's a kind of degree of abstraction in your day-to-day life. It's meaningful abstraction, it's not meaningless abstraction, but it's a very different kind of thing from doing what farmers do. And I'm smiling here because a very good example of this disjuncture occurred when Bloomberg was putting his hat into the ring for the presidency, and he basically said, "Oh, anyone can do farming." I don't know if you remember that statement, but well, good luck. There's a lot of work. It's a different kind of work, but he's basically saying they're dummies. Politically, so, you know, very, very, very naive politically. But it is symptom. Sorry.
I said, well, that's the Democrats.
Well, that's. I don't want to get into, you know, but I just say that you know what that really illustrates is really this disjuncture. We can see it back in the ancient world. We can see it in when we read Plato, when we look at Aristophanes. It's a common phenomenon, and this will be a phenomenon again, one of those patterned things, entrenched things that we will see will be important when we get to the French Revolution. So this ultimately is leading to a breakdown of the feudal system, but as I said, remnants are still left, so it hasn't completely broken down, and it's the remnants that are going to really cause a problem, sort of staggered remnants. Okay, the religious wars. This is you know, because one of the questions is why was it that some 1700 years it had taken to, you know, build Christendom? Well, less you could say, but it was, you know, in the 1100s, 1200s, Christianity gets way into the north of Europe. But that had taken a long time. And there's already schisms between, you know, the Protestants, largely in the north, Catholics still in the south, and over in the east you've got the Orthodox. And each one of them is symptomatic of a break. But nevertheless, underneath it there's a sufficient cultural common capital that there's some common sense of purpose about what the meaning of life is through these stories, biblical stories. So, but, you know, how is it that this revolution can light a match to a powder keg of all that? And it really goes back to the Reformation. So even the Reformation, its earliest roots were in humanism. So again, the educated, those people reading books, the humanists were going around. See, one of the, you know, I spoke about the breakdown of urban life. One of the losers in that breakdown was literacy, and books had just disappeared. So beginning around the 14th century, there's a real hunger to go and scout out books and find them and start reading them and translating them. For example, when Dante, who mentions Homer in the Divine Comedy, written in 1300 to 1307, when he writes this, he can't read Homer. There's no copy of Homer around anywhere, in translation or in Greek. He can't read it. But he knows of it. So by the time of these humanists are going around rediscovering all these texts, and by the time in the middle of the 15th century, a whole swag of new texts are being discovered. Remember Luther's early 16th century, and he too is part and parcel of this humanist movement, insofar as the thing about the reformers is they demand, or they require, that people go back and study the Bible in and of itself. For the scholars, that also means reading the languages, learning the languages of it. For Luther, the spirit of Christianity is also a spirit of translation, which is part of the Christian tradition. The idea was simply to have a Bible in every home. This was basically the Reformation was a huge literacy push. literacy push is starting to change people. It's starting to change how they think about things. What this is meaning for the Catholic part of Christendom, within Catholic Christendom, reading the Bible was never part of daily life. The Bible was incorporated into the rituals of Catholic practice, but reading, anybody, having a Bible in your home, in fact, it was prohibited in Italy until the middle of the 18th century to even translate the Bible. That is a protracted reaction to the Reformation. And other attempts elsewhere to try and Wycliffe in England to try and get the Bible rendered into English. There was deep opposition to it. You've got to remember too, I think I said this last week, the Catholic Church, imagine it like this huge trade union. That's a Dearman McCulloch in his good book, The History of Christianity, in one little place uses that. I think that's a great formulation of it. And that's why there was so much animosity about what theology was being taught, what credentials one had, what you needed to be in a university, the clerical qualifications you needed. All of this is really bound up with the fact that you have an economic skin as well as spiritual skin in the game. But your spiritual skin and your economic skin have become indistinguishable. The Reformation, of course, began as Luther's opposition to the payment of indulgences and simony, and this was exactly at the time that St. Peter's in Rome was being built. So that is happening at a time in which the Italian city-states are really trying to become hegemonic powers. They're caught up in all sorts of wars against the French as well. Being Catholic didn't mean he didn't go to war with each other. Okay. Luther was enabled by the German princes. Now, unlike France and Spain, the German princes hadn't won concessions until Luther comes along, and that's when they band together, and that's where they... So basically, you could say the extraction process, where now, and it's been happening for a number of hundred years now, the papacy is demanding tributes and tithes and money that comes to them that bypass the political system. They also bypass the political system in demanding that anyone who's a member of the clergy is only beholden to ecclesiastical law, not domestic law. So there's all sorts of tensions that this brings about. But France didn't have a Reformation. This is the point. Or at least there were reformers there, but the French state and the French primary office holders, which includes the clergy, especially the upper clergy, this hasn't been reformed. But, in a Protestant sense, but certain reforms had happened. And that is to say that the French church had a certain degree of independence from Rome. And that ultimately really made a difference. This is why, just a minute, I'll go back there a second. Was there something else? Okay. So, yeah, that's what I simply wanted to say. It was all about, ecclesiastical courts restricted taxes, but France had dealt with it in a very different way. I might have this slide the wrong way around. Okay, I'll go here first. The French church was largely national. Already. So you'll recall also in England that Henry VIII, he didn't reform the church so much as just took it away from Rome. That's why, because the church hadn't been sufficiently reformed, that the Anglicans and the Calvinists or the Puritans would be at such loggerheads, and this would be important in the English Revolution. But there were a number of phases of Gallicism. Just very quickly, it goes back to the 13th century. So there's a long pedigree of the church administration conforming to common law and canons of councils. Philip the Fair had already tried to centralize the French state, and one of the things he wanted to do was stop the flow of money going into France. That also led to even absconding, taking the Roman bishop or the head of the church from Rome and putting them in France, in Avignon. That was also a way of curtailing the outflux of money. So a settlement was reached. And ultimately, the nomination of bishops was in the hands of the crown, but the Pope had to make the appointment. But really, you know, you can see that there's a loosening of Roman power over France. And there was a declaration of French clergy under Louis XIV. There was to be no papal authority in temporal civil matters. He renewed the direct declaration of the Council of Superiority over the Pope, declares Gallican liberties over rules, customs, and institutions of the French Church. The French Church was not subject to discipline or levies without the clergy's consent, and the French bishops were not to attend any general council without permission of the crown. You can say, wow, these are serious, significant victories, and it's why the Reformation in France was only limited efficacy. But there were still reformers in France. Now, to understand the religious wars, we also need to bear in mind then that it is economic. As I said, there's going to be an economic scale. So the French clergy have managed to keep the benefits of national institution, or the French nation has managed to keep the benefits of economic protection, while at the same time, and centralization, domestic centralization, while at the same time keeping up the prestige and the offices that are part and parcel. So in a sense, when in Germany, for example, there's the Reformation in northern Germany, that means all these priests and nuns lose their jobs. So they have to go out in the world and find another job. Many of them will become university teachers, especially of the priests, of the higher priests. And this is the beginning of the importance of the university as a kind of pulpit of teaching the people how they should be, taking that over. So from the altar to the church pulpit to the cathedra, as it's cathedra, not cathedra. What do you call that? Whatever it's called, the lectern, that's the word I'm looking for, from the pulpit to the lectern. So you've managed to keep that, but there's other things that the reformers wanting to do that are taking hold of people and seizing their imagination. So there are still reformers there. But what you can see is these two worlds in France in collision, and the French Protestants are really the smaller group. Anti-monarchical and republican, like the Puritans I mentioned. So it comes out of Geneva. Geneva had been where Calvin had ensconced himself, set it up, and had become a kind of theocratic state, even though it was a theocratic state in which the separation between church and state was all important. But he had been training and sending French ministers into France. So by 1570, some 1,500 Protestant churches were in France, and the largest congregations, some 10% of the population, were in the south. They were called the Huguenots. So at times I would call them Protestants, other times Huguenots, but that's what they were. They were generally literate, little support amongst the peasantry. Why? Illiterate, peasantry not literate. They grew in regional towns. Often they belonged to the artisan classes, and they had significant representation as well amongst artisans, amongst lawyers, members of the judiciary. Members of the judiciary, that also meant the parliament. As we see, the parliament existed as an institution, but it was essentially a legal, not a political institution. We'll come back to that. And eventually even the nobles and then some clergy would be drawn into it. There was a lot of persecution of them. It mainly came from the people. It mainly came as an outbreak of rage, or an outburst of rage. Now, one of the myths of the French Revolution that we will look at is the people are always good. And that the reason the people do things badly is because the leaders have been bad. And this kind of myth, people still think this. If the leaders do this, then everybody will follow. I'm sorry, that's not right. And even if we go somewhere else, for example, and try to make sense of why the Muslims were expelled in Spain by Isabel and Ferdinand. You've got to, it's not just something orchestrated, and the story is often told as if it was an orchestration from the top down. No, the crown is frequently forced to react to try and restore the order because of this conflagration that is breaking out on the lower levels. And one of the big things that's breaking out is people don't trust each other because of the different god they're worshipping. Their contracts can't be trusted, their view of the world can't be trusted, their whole life world feels threatened. So there was a lot of extreme violence going on. The other thing, because it was, there's still such a large bit of feudal remnancy left over, you still got essentially a client feudal system. So when in the broader population you got more Huguenots coming in, driving out Catholics or Catholic, this is going to make the prince or the duke or whatever their name is, that the count or whoever they are presiding over that domicile, they will tend to be responsive. Occasionally you'll have someone who's very religious and come hell or high water, you're going to all stay Catholic. But if the move's made, so depending on the kind of class composition, this also affected the religious composition. This ultimately affected the territorial religious nature. Now, the other thing we need to bear in mind is that higher offices of the French clergy were filled by members of noble families. This seemed to make you're a family, you want to reproduce your wealth, where can you get it? There's a lot of wealth in the church, we'll send you there. You'll be taken care of. I can't marry, Mum, but if I'm a priest, don't worry, don't worry too much about that. And there wasn't too much worry about that. Not at this stage, anyway. But there was serious tensions between the lower clergy, who are often dirt poor, and the upper clergy, who tended to be very wealthy. So this led to a kind of resentment again within the church, and very often this would be quite seductive for the lower French clergy to change allegiance religiously. But the question of how much land and property there was in the church, and it had to do with this noble families, often making large beneficial gifts to the church, but then their own family being members of that church. You can see how it's a nice little racket going on. This is going to be a very big issue, because when the French Revolution comes, the question of how do we pay for this shit and the army we're building, church property is going to be a very big reason for it. So on the one hand, you've got all these philosophical ideas, enlightened ideas. On the other hand, you've got all these economic interests. And then you've got the pure, raw necessity of, we've got to keep this show on the road. We need to extract resources from somewhere. Where can we get it? The church. And look, this is essentially what, you've been a Gallican church already. You haven't been beholden to Rome. So why not, I'm giving a simplified rationale, why not just become appointed to the state of the French nation, and you give your ultimate loyalty to the French nation? Many would go along with it, and many would not. This would be a real source of conflict, especially in some regions, more Catholic, peasant-based regions like the Vendée, which we'll talk about later. So there's a number of, I don't want to get too much in this, but there's a number of events happen. One is the placard affair. Basically, a Huguenot slips in. They're putting up all these placards everywhere. So basically, the Huguenots are being persecuted, often having their faith in secret. And now there's this big Corpus Christi procession, and these placards are put up, and one is put in the king's room. That's basically saying we can get to you if we need to get to you. There was another conspiracy to kidnap the young King Francis and rescue him from the Guise family influence. The Guise family were an important Catholic family that meddling in, because not only have you got Catholics and Huguenots, but you've also got other players, noble families wanting to get hegemony within the state. The king's mother sought to reconcile, and she wanted to be the great reconciler. She was responsible for an edict of Saint Germain, which would forbid public displays of worship, but allowed Protestants to preach and worship in the countryside. And there were, other such attempts to mediate. Didn't go so well. Led to a civil war between the Protestant forces, led by Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, and the Catholics, led by the Guise family, who had massacred Huguenots, worshippers of the town of Vassy, and this was, a period of all-out civil wars. Then there's another edict, legal practice, but heavy restrictions. Protestant nobles could continue to exercise the new religion at home and on their estates. So out of sight, out of mind, and we'll leave it to you. And remember, one of the things about Protestantism is theologically it had argued that the relationship between a person and their God is a purely private relationship. So you could say that the Catholics are taking advantage of this theological tenet and say, well, yeah, you do that. You're not going to really worry if you do it, but of course they're going to. Of course, that's not what they want. And one of the consequences is that the Protestant nobles were also in leadership positions, securing the rights of Protestants against the crown. So the ground is being prepared for political revolts of nobles against the crown, and that's another issue. Remember me saying it's not uncommon for nobles to revolt against the crown for all sorts of reasons, but this is going to be a very important push behind that. Bartholomew's massacre of 1572. This was an event that really etched itself in French memory. In his chapter on the French Revolution and Out of Revolution by Rosenstock-Huessy, I've mentioned to you before, he makes a very big deal of this massacre, and I think that's very good. I think most people writing about it tend to ignore it. But if you think that the religious wars matter and the Huguenots matter, then this massacre of 1572, which was basically instigated by the University of Paris. So the university powers had basically played a big part in this. So there's meant to be a long procession as Henry Navarre, who would eventually become king and then renounce his Protestantism, but the Protestant king was going to marry a Catholic, and then there was this massacre. One has to remember too that the university in Paris had a long pedigree of being the most important theological training ground within Christendom of the Catholic faith. So you can see that they're very reluctant to see anything going more in the direction of Protestants. Their whole raison d'etre, their whole stake in the system is being threatened. Ostensibly, this had been triggered by an assassination attempt upon the Huguenot leader, but it seems to have been pretty well orchestrated. So thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered, and it lasted for 3 days. And this would really etch itself in the memories of the Huguenots. Here's just a map where you can see where the Huguenots are, the Bourbon presence, and the Guise control of the Catholic League. So, contestations going on between the Bourbons, who would eventually, the Bourbon family would become the crown. So there's a sheer political conflict plus this religious conflict going on in these wars. All Protestant rights were initially revoked. There was internal divisions within the Catholics. So the Catholic leagues, again, we can see there's a sociological dimension of it. The league consisted of urban nobles and magistrates, lawyers, royal officers, merchants, and curates, and those that were loyal to the crown. That's why we had that map earlier, the Guise lot and the Bourbon lot. So you can see the crown. Remember what we said about the 3 orders, way back when. You can see that the crown is really an old institution whose power base is the old orders. And the urbanizing professionalizing, many drifting to Protestants, but not all. They've got a different set of loyalties, a different set of commitment, a different world which they want to be part of, and which they want to make, and which they want to gain from. Ultimately, the king was forced by the Duke of Guise not to deal with heretics. Henry III, Guise was killed, mother and son in prison, but the revolt continued. Then there's a peace settlement. Henry III is assassinated. Henry de Vere becomes king, becomes a Catholic. He basically says it's not worth it being a Protestant if I'd rather take the kingdom. But there's still these contestations. There's still the Catholic League wanting a revolutionary rule and reign of terror in urban centres, and it's controlling versus the traditionalists, including the parliaments. Parliament, again, an old institution. Then there's the bringing in the Spanish. I don't want to get too much caught in this. It's a flurry, but I want you to get a sense of how everything is being dragged in and how the symmetries are somewhat blurred, especially insofar as there's a contestation between noble powers and crown and what their interests are, because that's going to continue for a long time, all through the greater part of the 17th century, and I'll talk about that. There are also peasant wars involving Catholics and Protestants fighting together in southern parts of France against taxes, abuse of clerical and seigneurial rights of nobility. They would be resolved, but you can see here's an early symptom of this old problem and continuing problem. I can't read what I've written there. I'm sorry about that. So, by the end of the 16th century, it seemed the wars had been brought to an end of a sort. Protestants gained some civil rights. For the moment, they were eligible for admission to schools, colleges, and universities, could hold public offices, including posts in the Parliament. They were meant to receive state stipendiums, allowed to have their own troops in towns under their jurisdiction. But the elections of the deputies from the three estates meant it was an all-Catholic assembly. All-Catholic assembly, so basically nothing had been gained. Which meant the wars against the Huguenot centres returned, and regional connected with, this kept going on. And you get some idea of the scale of this at the siege of Brussels. Some 13,000 Protestants were killed, 5,000 to 8,000 surrendered. In 1685, the Edict of Nantes was replaced with the Edict of Fontainebleau, and that made Protestantism illegal. Now, over here on the right is a character called Blaise Pascal, and another thing that happens in the Catholic Church is there's a new movement that is Catholic, but its doctrines are very Protestant-like. And that's the Jansenists. And the Jansenists will also be seen as a threat to the crown as much as the Protestants. And what matters here is that Louis allies himself with the Jesuits. Where did the Jesuits come from originally? Spain. They come from Spain. What is Ignatius Loyola founds the order? Why does he found the order? He not much earlier than that. Well, no, about 100 years earlier, sorry, than this, he founds the order. The reason he founds the order is that he basically wants to give a spiritual army for the ideas of the Catholic Church. So that's what it's seen as, a spiritual army. But they're not French. The Jesuits aren't French. And they were seen as a threat to the University of Paris because you've got all these other Catholics there, although they're, going to kill the Huguenots. They don't want a bunch of Spaniards. And remember, Spain and France are traditionally in conflict with each other. They don't want them taking over. The Jesuits had also been blamed for the assassination of Henry III. And they were blamed by the Paris Parliament for having taught Jean Châtel, who had attempted to assassinate Henry IV as well. So the French Parliament had already, very early on, sought to expel the Jesuits. But as I said, Louis tied his lot in with the Jesuits. This would be an ongoing problem. There would be hatred towards the Jesuits building up in France. So it wasn't just that it's the Huguenots are wounded and resentful of things like the St. Bartholomew's massacre, or they're losing in the religious wars. It's also the fact that that other people, other French people, other Gallic Catholics, so to speak, hate the presence of the French. I mentioned the Jans, they would be declared heretics in 1713, and again, sided with the Pope, sided with the Jesuits. You can get an idea of how resented they were that by 1761 they'd have to be exiled. There was huge hostility to the Jesuits coming out of the churches. I'll just finish these two slides. It is a fact that over time, although these conflicts have been so great, over time the animosities started to peter out. Many Huguenots drifted into Paris. Paris, though, was often the enemy, the center of enmity towards the crown. What did Louis do? He moved to Versailles, outside Paris. So there's this enmity towards Paris, and the Huguenots are flourishing in Paris. So there's a whole new mindset. And remember, Huguenots, Jansenists, all these heretical types from the Catholic perspective are actually vehicles for a certain type of social consciousness about the political order. So there's a tacit toleration. I'd mentioned the Enlightenment before. The really founding modern philosopher of the Enlightenment, there's going to be a few contenders for this, but I think a knockdown case can always be made for René Descartes. Now, René Descartes was ultimately a philosopher of science, is what interested him. But basically, he represented a new intellectual type. And this was the man who trusted the natural light of his own reason. Here, you no longer got someone who's interested in philosophy, but a cleric. That was the typical philosopher previously. Here you've got someone, an independently minded thinker, able to get money from elsewhere. He taught in Sweden. He taught the Princess of Sweden, for example, traveling around the place, getting money, able to push his ideas, his books sell. And it's a picture, it's ultimately a picture of the world, which is a picture of a new world. Indeed, one of the books, he doesn't publish it in his lifetime, but it's called The World. And in that book, he argues that miracles are impossible. Because if miracles were possible, then God would be a deceiver. But because God is not a deceiver, that means everything that happens in nature happens because of laws. And I, René Descartes, have a method that will help you understand those laws. You can see that on the one hand, and many Catholics would end up supporting Descartes, by the way, but what's happened is the whole narrative around what God is has changed. So there's an arc between the God of Descartes, remember the God of the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. That's the Descartes of God. That's when I was speaking about deism. That's the kind of God that's left. To put it bluntly, it's a metaphysical entity. It's not a figure that issues commands as the biblical God is. Okay, last one. So France was Catholic, but it did not have the same geopolitical interests as necessarily as other Catholic nations. It was in constant conflict with Spain. It had been embroiled in wars with Catholic Italy. I'd mentioned them. I meant Spain. The Ottoman War in the middle of the 16th century. The 80 Years' War, sided with the Dutch against the Spanish. The Franco-Spanish War. In the 30 Years' War, it had ultimately allied itself with Protestant Sweden. And 30 Years' War is usually remembered as a religious war, but except for the fact that it was, but it wasn't. And it really then was the opportunity for the Bourbons to establish their hegemony and centralize. It was the beginning really of the centralization of the French state. It's that issue of centralization, again, of the French state that's going to be very important for what will happen in the French Revolution. And one of the things that we'll see in the French Revolution is that one of the huge conflicts that's ultimately the conflict between the Gironde, a ruling party at a time that then gets ousted by the group that's in cahoots with the Jacobins, is all around centralization, whether it should be a federal system or a centralized system. And you recall in the United States, you ended up with a federal system. But for the French revolutionaries, I'm just anticipating something we're going to talk about though, but for the French revolutionaries, it's unity or else nothing. So a federal system is seen by the Jacobins as contrary to revolution. So Britain had been war against Spain and France. I mentioned the Queen Anne's War. Other wars involving the War of Polish Succession, France again, and so on. So here's the reason I'm mentioning this now, is that all the way through, nothing that's happening internally can be completely separated from what's happening externally. But it's very often when you read something, you get caught up in the minutiae of everything internal, that other stuff is seen as, you know, of only peripheral importance. It's not of peripheral importance. It's really important. But as Louis XIV had become the Sun King, had made the crown, the monarch, he had completed, in a sense, the work of Philip the Fair, going way back to the 13th century. Now France is a really strong absolutist state. He finds people writing tracts that can support the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which is by no means the divine right of kings. What was being interpreted in this absolutist way was by no means a traditional Christian doctrine, even though it would be presented as that. But all these other alliances, and these other alliances are going to be central also to when we start talking about the outbreak of the French Revolution. Okay, thank you very much. We'll call it a day there. Cheers, Maya.